Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of the Human Sciences by Jason Ananda Josephson-Storm, narrated by Chris Macdonnell. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and ebook formats of the book. The absence of myth is also a myth, the coldest, the purest, the only true myth. Georges Bataille, L'absence du mythe, 1947. A note on texts and translations. Archives consulted, physically or digitally: Bibliothèque nationale de France, the Fraser Collection at Trinity College, University of Cambridge, the Rudolf Carnap papers at the University of Pittsburgh Library, the University of Vienna Archive, and the Max Weber Archive at the Bayerischen Akademie der Wissenschaften. Translations from Danish, French, German, Japanese, Latin, Polish, Spanish, and Swedish are my own unless otherwise noted, and I accept full responsibility for any errors. Introduction. The war against mystery and magic was, for modernity, the war of liberation leading to the Declaration of Reason's independence. To win the stakes, to win all of them, and to win them for good, the world had to be despiritualized, deanimated. Zygmunt Bauman, Intimations of Postmodernity, 1992. Eusapia is within our walls. Her presence communicates a kind of incoherent life to material objects, and peoples the void with phantoms. Georges Montogoyer, Les Parisiens d'à présent, 1897. Paris, 1907. Marie Curie sat in the sumptuous chambers of an apartment on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. As the lights were dimmed, the chemist joined hands with the man sitting next to her, and together they watched the psychic medium across the table begin to shake and mumble, speaking in a strange low voice, overcome by the force of a possessing spirit called John King. Eusapia Palladino, as the psychic was called, was believed to be able to make objects move without touching them, and to produce visions of light or luminescent points, visions of hands or limbs, sometimes in the form of black shadows, sometimes as phosphorescent. Indeed, as Curie and others later recounted in that very séance, luminous points began to appear in the darkness, as if crowning Eusapia's head in a shimmering halo. Slowly, the medium extended her hands and ran them through Marie Curie's hair, passing on a glowing luminescence. It seemed that the presence of unseen powers had been confirmed. By all rights, Marie Curie should not have been there. She was in many respects a paragon of the period's scientific establishment, a hard-headed and critical thinker who had made a number of stunning discoveries. The first woman to win a Nobel Prize, she is one of the very few people in history to win it twice, physics and chemistry. Curie's presence at a spiritualist séance is a problem, because a great many theorists have argued that one of the things that makes the modern world modern is the rejection of animism, basically, that we have eliminated ghosts, demons, and spirits from the contemporary world view. While historians of spiritualism know different, it is widely believed that modernizers like Curie had no truck with invisible forces. Most scholars, therefore, would be surprised to learn that she was conjuring ghosts or studying paranormal manifestations as part of her physics research. This book will address not only spiritualism's allure, but also why that account of modernity as despiritualization is itself a myth. It is tempting to imagine that Curie wanted to believe in the spectral persistence of the souls of the dead because of her recent widowhood. After all, her husband Pierre had passed away in April 1906, and her diaries from the period frequently expressed her profound longing to communicate with him. But this was not the first séance Marie Curie had attended, and indeed the Curies had engaged in psychical research together before his sudden death. For 3 years, starting in 1905, some of France's most famous scientists had assembled in apartments and laboratories in Paris to study this particular Italian spirit medium, Eusapia Palladino. In addition to the Curies, others often in attendance were the celebrated physiologist Jacques-Arsène d'Arsonval, the eminent psychiatrist Gilbert Ballet, the aristocratic doctor Count Arnaud de Gramont, and 3 future Nobel Prize winners, the physicist Jean-Baptiste Perrin, the physiologist Charles Richet, and the philosopher Henri Bergson. The French were not the only ones interested in Eusapia. From 1872 until her death in 1918, her powers were tested by teams of researchers in England, Italy, Poland, Germany, Russia, and the United States. The paranormal researchers who investigated Eusapia were not marginal eccentrics, but the cutting edge of the period's academic establishment. Yet these researchers were exploring areas that were often marked out by their contemporaries as occult, if not downright magical. They did so not as a legacy of medieval superstitions, nor generally as a way to overturn science, but rather as a means to extend its borders. Not everyone who met with Eusapia was a believer in the powers of the beyond. Some were convinced she was a charlatan, but others came to grant that something extraordinary happened in those darkened rooms. In Paris one could find the full spectrum, from skeptics to spiritualist believers, to those who preferred to explain the sessions in terms of previously unrecognized forms of energy. Bergson, for example, began with serious doubts, but ended up producing a paranormally informed philosophy, and even becoming president of the British Society for Psychical Research in 1913. This is perhaps less surprising for a philosopher famous for formulating élan vital, and one whose sister, Moina Mathers, née Mina Bergson, was a co-founder of one of the period's most famous magical organizations, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But other figures whose professions were more conventionally scientific were also affected by their experiences with Eusapia. In one of the last letters before his death, addressed to Louis-Georges Aiguille, April 14, 1906, Pierre Curie remarked, "We have had several more séances with the medium Eusapia Palladino. We already had sessions with her last summer. The result is that these phenomena really exist, and it is no longer possible for me to doubt them. It is incredible, but it is so, and it is impossible to deny it after the sessions, which we performed under perfectly controlled conditions." He added, "In my opinion, there is here a whole domain of completely new facts and physical states of space about which we have had no conception." While Marie lacked some of her husband's enthusiasm, she remarked in French in a letter to a friend on April 16, 1906, "We recently attended a few séances with Eusapia, some of which have seemed very convincing. It is a matter of the greatest interest." In a Polish letter to a friend, however, she was less guarded, declaring, "Personally, I am quite willing to accept the existence of unusual powers in mediums such as Eusapia or Ms. Stanisława Tomczyk." Even the psychologist William James, although he had not witnessed Eusapia firsthand, asserted that her phenomena probably are genuine seems to me established. The point here is not to mock William James and the Curies for their gullibility, much less to advocate on their authority that mediums really did once channel the dead. Indeed, our main business is not to discuss physics or spirits as such, but rather to provide a cultural and intellectual history of social scientists and philosophers. In doing so, I challenge one conventional notion of modernity, and suggest that we should be less surprised than we usually are to find scientists of all stripes keeping company with magicians, that reason does not eliminate superstition, but piggybacks upon it, that mechanism often produces vitalism, and that often, in a single room, we can find both séance and science. The single most familiar story in the history of science is the tale of Disenchantment, of magic's exit from the henceforth law-governed world. I am here to tell you that as broad cultural history, this narrative is wrong. Attempts to suppress magic have historically failed more often than they've succeeded. It is unclear to me that science necessarily deanimates nature. In fact, I will argue à la Bruno Latour that we have never been disenchanted. And for those readers who have already suspected the persistence of magic in modernity, I will trace the genealogy of the myth of disenchantment and how it came to function as a regulative ideal. A philosophical archaeology of the disenchantment of the world. Enlightenment's program was the disenchantment of the world. In the authority of universal concepts, the Enlightenment detected a fear of the demons through whose effigies human beings had tried to influence nature in magic rituals. From now on, matter was finally to be controlled without the illusion of immanent powers or hidden properties. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, Dialektik der Aufklärung, 1947. While many of the old master narratives have been unravelling, it is still widely supposed that the defining feature of modernity is the departure of the supernatural. Modernization is often equated with the rise of instrumental reason, the gradual alienation of humanity from nature, and the production of a bureaucratic and technological life world stripped of mystery and wonder. Scholars often pin this narrative to Max Weber's phrase, Die Entzauberung der Welt, the disenchantment, or literally demagicking of the world. Indeed, if there is one thing we've been taught to take for granted, it is that the contemporary industrial capitalist societies of Western Europe and North America have lost their magic, and that it is this absence that makes them modern. As the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor summarized in 2011, everyone can agree that one of the big differences between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago is that they lived in an enchanted world and we do not. Disenchantment is also a component of the standard account of secularization. According to thinkers like Taylor, part of the way that religion lost its grip on the modern subject was through science eliminating the supernatural. In recent years, support for the classical secularization thesis has withered in the face of religious revivals, but even the most vociferous critics of the death of God usually grant the decline of magic, at least in Western Europe, if nowhere else. Indeed, part of relativizing secularism is often to present secularism as Protestant, which in turn is positioned as anti-magical. If the post-secular resurgence of religion is tied to the limits of reason, magic and technology are still widely believed to be opposed, and only a few would claim that magic is making a comeback. First and foremost, I want to challenge this model, to rewrite this particular account of modernity and its rupture from the pre-modern past. I am not alone in the study of modernity's enchantments, but the task takes on a special urgency because versions of the disenchantment thesis have recently found fresh purchase, anchoring new movements in philosophy and political theory. Although they do not speak with one voice, a host of thinkers, Karen Barad, Jane Bennett, William Connolly, Eduardo Kuhn, Manuel Vasquez, and others, have charged modern philosophy with despiritualizing nature and rendering matter dead and inanimate. In response, they aim to recover alternate animating ontologies, sometimes referred to as agential realism or enchanted materialism. While I am sympathetic to these movements, I think that their diagnosis of the current dilemma too quickly grants, even as it inverts, the myth of Euro-American modernity and its putative relationship to rationality and nature. Simply put, these new philosophers, like the post-structuralists they seek to replace, are rebelling against a hegemon that never achieved full mastery. The enchanted ontologies and spiritualized orientations to nature they describe as missing have been available all along. In what follows, it is both the mythic construction and contradictions of the supposedly hegemonic ontology that I want to explore. I am particularly interested in the formation of the old-fashioned but entrenched narrative that describes the history of the modern scientific paradigm in terms of the rise of mathematical physics and the construction of an influential model of a clockwork universe that no longer needed spirits or a deity to drive the motor of the cosmos. Leaving aside how few historical physicists actually subscribed to this austere model, what is fascinating to me is the way in which the image of a mechanical world took on its own life, especially among social theorists, and thus how it escaped the purview of the natural sciences to achieve an ambivalent status in the cultural formation of the contemporary world picture. From my perspective, this particular world picture is a myth insofar as it has taken on its own narrative force and bears little relationship to the status of physics at any given moment. Yet some version of this world picture was often presented exactly not as a myth, but as an ahistorical and universal real against which other myths were shattered. To be clear, I am not attacking the ontology of contemporary physics, but am instead interested in how a particular historical image of physics came to imprint the human sciences, and by doing so spilled over into the master description of modernity as such, even as the physicists themselves were often pushing against that model from the inside. In what follows, I ask, in the face of things like Curie's scientific seances, spiritualist revivals, and the modern resurgence of magical orders like the Golden Dawn, how did we get the idea that modernity meant disenchantment in the first place? I will answer this question by exploring the haunting presence of magic in the very instances when disenchantment was itself being theorized. While we know that wonder still dwells in the counterculture, and it is probably a truism that scientists often hold to strange ideas outside of their specific domain of expertise, I want to investigate the least likely people, the very theorists of modernity as disenchantment, and show how they worked out their various insights inside an occult context, in a social world overflowing with spirits and magic, and how the weirdness of that world generated so much normativity. This will put us in a position to disaggregate disenchantment into inconsistent and semi-overlapping claims regarding the loss of wonder, the deanimation of the world, the progressive rationalization of superstition, and, of course, the end of magic, which I show nevertheless share a common root. It is important indeed to track the persistence of the occult across the disciplines, and not just in the natural sciences. In Bruno Latour's own sociology, for instance. It is a sociological truism that those who study foreign cultures are themselves less religious, and few would imagine anthropologists to be easy believers in the magical. Indeed, as contemporary anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann has noted, for much of its history, a central task in sociology has been to explain how the elimination of magic was ever possible, and how it was that Western society moved into its rational mode. But I will show that the human sciences, Geisteswissenschaften, emerged as academic disciplines in the 19th century alongside flourishing theosophical and spiritualist movements, and shared the latter's fascination with magical knowledge and the spirits of the dead. There is much evidence that the spiritualists read social theory, and, conversely, that the social theorists were often up on their spiritualism. Moreover, it was often the self-professed magicians, not the sociologists, who were the first to decry despiritualization and the general loss of magic, even as they called for revivals. Other scholars have argued that religious studies, for one, has its origins in the European empires. This is a trenchant point that may nonetheless need refining, since the canonically early figures in the discipline, Max Müller, Max Weber, Marcel Mauss, never went to India or met an aboriginal Australian first-hand. They were, however, profoundly enmeshed in the occult milieu, and much of what they thought they knew about the non-West was mediated by European esotericism. Indeed, the very objects of their concern, their methods, and even their self-definition, still bear the marks of this important early encounter with the occult. The larger project works out this occult side of the human sciences, not just the texts and thinkers who did not make it into the canon, but also those canonical figures whose esoteric preoccupations have been systematically ignored or suppressed. Instead of displacing Eurocentricism by means of explicit comparison, what follows is a work of erasure. The private lives of many theorists of disenchantment seemingly run contrary to their own models. By exposing this, I aim to disrupt the old master narratives to make way for new ones. By analogue to a similar move in gender studies, in part I am trying to queer or render strange the hegemonic tradition. Furthermore, while the social sciences are often supposed to be one of the vectors for secularization and the displacement of magic, I will show that sociology and its cousins were more likely to birth new revivals of paganism, shamanism, and even magic. It was not just the human sciences, but also their accounts of modernity as disenchanted and secularized that were ironically articulated in the very period during which Britain, France, and Germany were in the midst of occult revivals. Indeed, I will argue that it was specifically in relation to this burgeoning culture of spirits and magic that European intellectuals gave birth to the myth of a mythless society. To clarify this seeming paradox, I need to explain what I mean by myth. The term myth is often used either polemically to indicate an erroneous belief or romantically to suggest an archaic or even sacred mode of narrative discourse. Although I admit to willfully evoking the polemical usage, by myth I mainly mean to gesture toward those repeated narrative symbols, e.g. the death of God, Achilles' heel, the naked truth, that are adopted as prefabricated tropes or metaphors and whose transposition carries unconscious meaning from one domain to another. The prefabricated trope I am most interested in is the myth of modernity itself, by which I mean not the stories from a particular epoch, but the very fable that there was such an age as modernity and that it had certain features. By way of explanation, Hans Robert Jauss has reminded us that modernity was not a historical event for which we might determine a date. 1492, 1648, 1789, 1868. Modernity is first and foremost the sign of a rupture. As a term and concept, it is a device for positing significant historical breaks. To speak of the modern means nothing so much as to talk of the current, of the putatively new, to describe a kind of novelty. That the term has been used for hundreds of years might seem through sheer repetition to forfeit its claims to originality. We might now know that modernity is as much a spatial as temporal category, and that to call a culture modern is to ally it with newness and to consign its opposite to colonization or the scrap heap of history. It is as much a project as a periodization, but the project of modernization and the period of modernity are typically entwined, because modernization works by projecting an aspirational and utopian myth of modernity toward which it aspires. In this respect, utopian modernity is always located elsewhere, e.g., often colonized subjects thought of the metropole as embodying modernity, or German philosophers looked to France as the epitome of the modern, while French thinkers looked to England for the same. It might seem that only the dystopian modernity is thought of as here and now. We should also remember that to call an era modern, even when criticized from a postmodern vantage, is to characterize the epoch in terms of its discontinuity with the past. There are different ways to stage that newness. Modernity is regularly equated with everything from specific artistic and philosophical movements to particular historical ruptures, to distinctive sociological processes, such as urbanization, industrialization, globalization, or various forms of rationalization. I will not unravel all the possible associations and nuances of the term. From among these, I aim to undermine the myth that what sets the modern world apart from the rest is that it has experienced disenchantment and a loss of myth. I am not claiming that industrialization never happened, nor am I denying that rationalization occurred in any cultural sphere. Rather, I am interested in the process by which Christendom increasingly exchanged its claim to be the unique bearer of divine revelation for the assertion that it uniquely apprehended an unmediated cosmos, and did so with the sparkling clarity of universal rationality. Sometimes this account of modernity has been celebratory, rejoicing in the ascent of European science and the end of superstition, but equally often it has been a lament, bemoaning a loss of wonder and magic. Another key impetus for my project is to provide a response to Horkheimer and Adorno's monumental Dialectic of Enlightenment, and an intervention into critical theory more broadly. Insofar as critical theory represents a single interpretive community, it might appear that we are mainly united by a common literary canon, and our willingness to repeat a particular story that this canon enshrines. Variants of this tale are to be found not only in Dialectic of Enlightenment, but also to some degree in many works of the Frankfurt School and its periphery, including Theodor Adorno, Negative Dialektik, Erich Fromm, Escape from Freedom, Max Horkheimer, Eclipse of Reason, Leo Löwenthal, Das Dämonische, Georg Lukács, Die Zerstörung der Vernunft, and Herbert Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man. One can even find it with a different effective tone in many of the writings of Jürgen Habermas. Critical theory broadly addresses the following problem. What went wrong with modernity such that it produced the horrors of totalitarianism and mass destruction, and not the utopia of a classless society? As expressed in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the question becomes one of why humanity, instead of entering a truly human state, is sinking into a new kind of barbarism. The Frankfurt School's answers to the broader question are essentially similar within a certain range of variations and important elaborations. To juxtapose a few, Fromm, 1941, freedom, though it has brought modern man independence and rationality, has made him isolated and thereby anxious and powerless, and hence he is tempted to submit to new totalitarian leaders in order to escape from the burden of his freedom. Horkheimer, 1947. It seems that even as technical knowledge expands the horizon of man's thought and activity, his autonomy appeared to be reduced. Advance in technical facilities for enlightenment is accompanied by a process of dehumanization. Marcuse, 1964. Instead of providing freedom from toil and domination, technological rationality becomes the great vehicle of better domination, creating a truly totalitarian universe in which society and nature, mind and body, are kept in a state of permanent mobilization for the defense of this universe. The primal form of critical theory's master narrative is that autonomous reason, or freedom, or science, or enlightenment, once yoked to the domination of nature, turns into its opposite, namely, the domination of humanity. In other words, the intellectual energies that were supposed to liberate us are now used to keep us in chains. To my taste, the version of this formulation that is most perspicacious is the pithy phrase in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Enlightenment reverts to mythology. It is easy to see the Weberian cast of this narrative and how it is linked to the deanimation of nature. Again, juxtapositions make this clear. Löwenthal, 1921. The primitive metaphysical world picture vanishes and makes room for the enlightened clearing, Aufklärung, of a heaven now stripped of stars. The world becomes disenchanted, die Welt wird entzaubert. The vividness of the demon's grimace turns into the abstractness of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?